Hi, everybody. This is God SAAD for the SAAD Truth. Yesterday, I found out about the latest incident of indignant outrage that is rooted in identity politics. Scarlett Johansson was supposed to play a trans man, let me just get this, in a movie called Rub and Tug. And then there was a big backlash because she is a cisgender woman who was going to play a trans man. That's not appropriate. And after originally trying to explain why she thought it was a good idea, she then caved in and released a statement. Here's the statement. Let me read it. In light of recent ethical questions raised surrounding my casting as Dante Tex Gill, I'd certainly like to know what those ethical issues are, but in any case, I have decided to respectfully withdraw my participation in the project. Our cultural understanding of transgender people continues to advance, and I've learned a lot from the community since making my first statement about my casting, and I realized it was insensitive. I have great admiration and love for the trans community, and I'm grateful that the conversation regarding inclusivity in Hollywood continues. According to GLAAD, LGBTQ plus characters dropped 40% in 2017 from the previous year, with no representation of trans characters in any major studio release. While I would have loved the opportunity to bring Dante's story and transition to life, I understand why many feel he should be portrayed by a transgender person, and I'm thankful that this casting debate, albeit controversial, has sparked a larger conversation about diversity and representation in film. I believe that all artists should be considered equally and fairly. Well, they're not in this case. She is a woman who is, quote, cisgender, therefore she's out of the running. My production team, These Pictures, actively pursues projects that both entertain and push boundaries. We look forward to working with every community to bring these most poignant and important stories to audiences worldwide. So what I decided to do is to use the victimology poker framework or the oppression Olympics and look for, again, one of the ways that you demonstrate whether something is a good idea or not is to offer analogous situations, test the idea using other boundary conditions. And so, of course, while there's no doubt that there's discrimination against trans people, there's discrimination against all sorts of people. Trans people do not hold the monopoly over victimhood. But in any case, disabled people certainly, on average, would score higher on the victimology poker ladder, if you'd like. No one would contest that. And certainly some of the examples that I'll give shortly where people are going through excruciating misery because of their disabilities would score them much higher than the fact that someone wasn't treated nicely in a restaurant and wasn't addressed by the right pronoun. And again, this is not to make light of any bigotry that anybody faces. Believe me, I escaped genocidal religious hatred in Lebanon, so no one could lecture me about being the recipient of hate. But in any case, so what I thought I would do is I'm only looking at Oscar-winning performances, and this is certainly not an exhaustive list. I spent maybe 10-15 minutes looking at Oscar winners who played disabled characters. You ready? All right. Daniel Day-Lewis in the late 80s acted in a movie called My Left Foot, where he was playing the part of someone who suffered from cerebral palsy. Now, very few people would argue that if we used a utilitarian measure of pleasure and pain, few people would argue that someone who is suffering from cerebral palsy is unlikely to be suffering more than the average trans person that walks around. So this is someone who you could almost not think of someone who scores higher in true victimhood, in the amount that they suffer in ways that are unimaginable. They suffer from cerebral palsy. Yet it was played by a, quote, abled person who won an Academy Award. So shouldn't we, by the exact same logic, there's literally zero ways that you could not argue that this is perfectly analogous. Should not Daniel Day-Lewis not have played this role since he was faking having cerebral palsy? You know, this thing called acting? Let's go on. Dustin Hoffman won the Best Actor Oscar for Rain Man because he played an autistic savant. Well, that's not right. We should have chosen a truly autistic savant to play that role. There aren't enough depictions of people who truly suffer from cerebral palsy or who truly are autistic savants in movies. So it was wrong to have chosen Dustin Hoffman. Let's go on. Geoffrey Rush in Shine, Australian actor, 1996, won the Best Actor Oscar for playing someone who suffered from mental illness, who had a complete nervous breakdown, a mental breakdown. Now, of course, endless people around the world suffer from the debilitating scourge of mental illness. And to the extent that this gentleman, Geoffrey Rush, was probably not experiencing a mental breakdown as he was filming the movie, then it wasn't right. They should have picked someone who was in the throes of a mental breakdown so that we can see true people with mental illness rather than actors playing someone who's mentally ill. Let's go on. Eddie Redmayne recently won an Oscar for playing Stephen Hawking, who suffers from ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease. How many people have suffered more than Stephen Hawking? Probably more than any trans person who's ever existed. Yet, it was played by an able-bodied person. It was played by someone, this was in the movie Theory of Everything, it was played by someone who acted as though he were Stephen Hawking. They didn't find someone who had ALS so that we could have more representations and depictions of people who truly have ALS. There are many people who have ALS. It's a tragedy. How come we don't have them more displayed in movies? Al Pacino won the Oscar in the early 90s for Scent of a Woman, playing a blind man. Very few people would say that it's a wonderful gift to not have the gift of sight. Yet, we could have found a truly blind person to play this role rather than Al Pacino. Why did we pick Al Pacino to pretend as though he were blind? Let's go on. Jamie Foxx in, I think, 2004, 2005, played Ray Charles, the famous singer and musician who was blind, and he won an Oscar for it. Why did we pick someone who could see to play that person? We need more representation of blind people in movies. Holly Hunter won the Oscar in The Piano. She played the role of a mute person. Why didn't we truly pick someone who was unable to speak? We need more representations of mute people. And then finally, Tom Hanks, in 1993, I think it was 1993, won the Oscar for his portrayal of a lawyer who succumbs to AIDS. And it tells the story of the bigotry that he faced, the homophobia that he faced in his law firm. And he eventually succumbs to AIDS. Well, why didn't they... First of all, he wasn't gay. So why are they picking a heterosexual man to play a gay man? There needed to have been a gay man who is truly battling AIDS. That would have been the proper thing. Using the exact same logic. It is the identical logic that was used for Scarlett Johansson and the trans issue. But now the trans issue has become something that is untouchable. In the same way that you can't say, the N-word, right? And one could argue rightfully so. People should not be overtly racist. Now it is a absolute revealed truth that you never question trans activism. This, by the way, does not in any way imply that I don't support trans rights. I support the rights of every individual to live a life free of bigotry and with full dignity. I can't repeat this enough times. This doesn't mean that it is in any way a good idea that an actress cannot play a role and actually pursue her job of acting by putting herself in the character of another individual. That's what actors do. Incidentally, if you want to push forward the trans narrative, the trans activism, then just from a pragmatic perspective, having one of the best known actresses play that role would probably yield much greater attention to your movie. Many more people will go see the movie. Many more people will be engaged in the trans issue. Many more people might be willing to get involved in trans rights. So from a strictly pragmatic perspective, right, if you were trying to argue what is the mechanism by which we can diffuse the trans narrative as best as we can as trans activists, then one could argue that having Scarlett Johansson remove herself in utter cowardice because she's afraid of the mob is actually a bad outcome for trans activism. So again, I just gave you an analogy where I took people who are extraordinarily more, have higher scores on victimology poker, on Oppression Olympics. These are people who suffer from terrible disabilities, where they suffer every day. And yet I gave you a whole bunch of examples whereby each of those manifestations of disabilities was acted by an able-bodied person. There you have it, folks. The end result of this, as many of you have heard me say and others have said, is that the snake ends up going around and eating its own tail. This is what's happening now. It's a frenzy. It's an orgiastic frenzy of nonsense. The quicker we are able to eradicate identity politics and all of the associated cancers of the human mind from our zeitgeist, the quicker we can return to a recognition of the dignity of the individual, that's when we will wrestle back freedom from the throes of these enemies of reason. Have a good day, everybody.